We think there are stories that history forgets on purpose, not because they aren't remarkable, but because the people in them were never meant to matter. This is one of those stories. Pull up a chair. We want you to hear it properly. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which is perhaps the cruelest day of the week for bad news. Mondays carry their own weight and people are already braced. But Tuesday has no such preparation. It arrives with the quiet assumption that things are still fine. The morning of the 14th of March, 1902, was cold in the particular way that Pictou County, Nova Scotia knows cold. Not the dramatic, killing cold of January, but the mean, lingering cold of early spring, the kind that makes you believe winter has finally let go and then snatches that belief right back. The frost was still hard on the roof of the cooperage, where 19-year-old Nora Sutcliffe had slept the last 4 years of her life. Curled on a cot behind the drying racks, surrounded by the smell of fresh-cut white oak and wood shavings and pine tar. She had been awake since before the light. She usually was. Old Duncan Vey, her master, and the only person she might have called family, had taught her that the best hour of a cooper's day was the one before anyone else arrived. When the wood was cold and tight and honest, before the heat of work made it compliant. He said you could hear what a barrel wanted to become if the shop was quiet enough. She had believed him. She still did. She was shaping the bilge stave of a 30-gallon flour barrel when the boy from the postal office came through the side door, without knocking. The way people do when they carry news they think is important enough to excuse the rudeness. He held out a folded paper sealed with the embossed mark of the Nova Scotia Barristers' Society. She took it with both hands, the way Duncan had taught her to receive anything worth receiving. The boy left without a word. She knew before she opened it. Duncan had been ill since November, and they had both known what the illness was. She had tended him through the worst of the winter, keeping his fire, going through the night, bringing broth from the tavern woman across the lane, who charged too much but made good stock. He had died 12 days ago in the bed above the cooperage, quietly, between one breath and the next, while Nora sat in the chair beside him and read aloud from the surveyor's atlas he kept on his nightstand. Not because it was interesting, but because the sound of someone's voice was what he had asked for. The letter confirmed what she had already suspected. The cooperage, the tools, the building itself, the lease on the land, all of it had been held in an arrangement between Duncan and his nephew. A man named Reginald Vey, who had provided the capital 30 years ago, and whose name appeared on the original deed. Duncan had never owned it outright, a fact he had apparently kept from Nora with the gentle, protective dishonesty of someone who believed tomorrow would arrange itself. Reginald Vey's solicitor wrote with brisk efficiency. The property would be assumed under the terms of the original agreement, effective at the end of the month. Miss Sutcliffe was welcome to remove any personal belongings by that date. The estate expressed its condolences for her loss. 22 days. That was what she had. She set the letter down on the workbench beside the unfinished stave and stood very still for a moment. The shop smelled of oak and iron and the particular tang of linseed oil, and she breathed it in once, deliberately, the way you breathe in a place when you know you are beginning the process of leaving it. Then she picked up the draw knife and went back to the stave, because the barrel still needed finishing. And because there was nothing else to do yet but think, and thinking was easier when her hands were moving. You might wonder, if you've never found yourself in such a position, what it feels like to have the inventory of your life reduced to its essentials in a single morning. We can tell you, because Nora herself described it years later, with a clarity that surprised everyone who heard it. She said it felt, at first, less like fear and more like arithmetic. You start counting. You subtract what you cannot keep, and what you have left is the shape of the problem. What Nora had by her own counting was this: $7.40 in a tobacco tin under the cot. Her tools, a full set, the best Duncan had owned, and the ones he had placed in her hands himself over 4 years of apprenticeship. A hollowing knife, a chiv, a sun plane, a topping plane, a crow's iron, a set of truss hoops she had forged herself under his instruction, and his own draw knife, the one with the rosewood handles worn smooth on one sides from 40 years of his grip. That draw knife was the only thing in the world she would not sell under any circumstances. It was the last object his hands had shaped anything with, and it would stay with her if she slept in a ditch. She had her craft. 4 years of 7-day weeks, of burned fingertips and strained shoulders and calluses that had long since stopped hurting, of learning to read the grain of white oak the way some people read faces. She could make a barrel that would hold salt cod for a winter crossing without weeping a drop. She knew that to be true because she had made them, dozens of them, and not one had come back. In a port county, in the age of cod and salt and lumber, that was not nothing. It might, if she was careful, be everything. What she did not have was a name, not in the sense that mattered for business. Duncan had always been the one the fishing families came to, the one the merchants sent their orders to. Nora had done the work, more of it than anyone outside the cooperative knew. But she had done it as Duncan's girl, Duncan's apprentice, the young woman with the quick hands and the quiet manner. She had no trade registration, no journeyman's papers, no agreement with a single merchant that bore her own signature. She existed, in the commercial record of Pictou County, barely at all. She spent the first 3 evenings after the letter-making lists. She sat at the workbench by lamplight after the last of the light failed, writing in the margins of the order ledger Duncan had kept, because it was the only paper she had in abundance. On one side she wrote what she knew how to do. On the other she wrote what she would need to do it. The gap between the 2 columns was not impossibly wide, but it was real. She could not afford to rent a cooperative space in town. The going rate for a shop floor with a forge was $12 a month, and she had $7.40. She could not hire herself out to another cooper, because the only other established cooper in Pictou was a man named Orrin Sloan, who had underbid Duncan's work for a decade out of spite, and would not take her on out of principle and probably something worse. She could not simply present herself to the fish merchants as a capable pair of hands. Because she had tried that already, briefly, the morning after she received the letter, calling on Mr. Theodore Ames at his office above the salt warehouse on the quay. He had listened politely and told her he bought his barrels from Sloan now and saw no reason to change his arrangements. He had not been unkind. He had simply not seen her, not really. Not as a tradesperson with a skill and a service, but as a young woman standing in a place where young women did not typically stand, asking for something he was not accustomed to being asked for. That evening she sat with the lists and looked at them for a long time. She was not afraid, exactly. Or rather, she was afraid the way you are afraid of a river you have to cross. The fear is real and it is appropriate. But it does not mean you don't cross. Her gaze drifted to the shelves along the far wall, where Duncan's order books went back 22 years. She had catalogued them herself the previous autumn, a quiet autumn project, and she knew what was in them. 22 years of names and measurements and specifications, of particular clients who wanted their salt barrels coopered tight to a certain gauge, of fishing captains who ordered the same 42-gallon herring barrel every spring before the season opened, of a smokehouse operation in Maragamish that took 6 barrels of apple wood staves every fall and would take them again if someone offered them. Duncan had not left her the building. He had not left her the lease, or the deed, or the commercial accounts. But he had left her 22 years of every customer relationship he had ever built, written in his own cramped hand in 17 order books stacked on a shelf. The world would not have called that an inheritance. She did. She began writing letters that night, and she wrote them every night for a week. She wrote to the fishing captains, to the salt merchants, to the smokehouse in Maragamish, to the cooperative at Lyons Brook. She did not apologize for Duncan's absence, though she acknowledged it. She wrote plainly about what she could do and what she had made, and she gave references. The names of merchants who had received her barrels without knowing they were hers, because they had gone out under Duncan's mark. She wrote that she intended to register her own mark, the letters NSC, stamped in a diamond, within the month. She did not ask for charity. She offered a service. The distinction was one Duncan had drilled into her, and she felt him in the language of every letter. She had nowhere to set up a shop. That was the central problem. And she turned it over in her mind the way you turn a piece of wood, looking for the best face to start from. She could not afford a shop, but what she could afford, if she was careful, was to go to the work instead of waiting for the work to come to her. There was, on the southern road out of Pictou toward the Straits, a cooperative that had been abandoned for 3 years. A low building on a lot that belonged to an old farmer named August Fenwick, who had leased it to a barrel maker from New Brunswick, who had lasted 1 winter before going back across the border. Nora had ridden past it on the cart many times, and she knew, because Duncan had mentioned it once with the mild professional interest of a man assessing what might have been, that the forge was still inside and the drying racks were sound. She rode out to August Fenwick's farm on a Saturday. He was a man in his 70s, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions about land and weather. And he listened to her without interruption. She explained what she wanted and what she could offer. She had $7, which was not 12. She proposed $4 a month for the use of the building and the forge, with the understanding that she would repair what she found broken and return it in better condition than she found it. She offered the first month and the last month up front, which left her with nothing, or nearly nothing. August Fenwick looked at her for a long moment, the way people do when they are deciding whether to trust someone. He asked her 3 questions. What had she made most recently? She described the flour barrels she had been working on for the miller in town. Could she show him one? She told him she could arrange it. And then, she told us he paused for a very long time before asking the third one. He asked her who had taught her. She said Duncan Vey's name, and something shifted in August Fenwick's face. He did not say why. He only said that Duncan had coopered the rain barrels for his farmhouse 15 years ago, and they had never leaked. He was quiet for another moment. Then he told her the $4 figure was acceptable, and that he would like 2 barrels for his cold cellar at cost when she had the capacity. They shook hands at his gate in the thin March sunlight, and Nora rode back to Pictou with 2 months' rent paid and a building to work in, and exactly $1.40 to her name. What happened next is the part of this story that we want you to sit with. Because it is the part that is easy to skip over when you tell it quickly, and it is also the part that matters most. She moved into the Fenwick Cooperative on the 27th of March, with her tools and her cot, and a sack of oats, and a week's worth of hardtack and salt fish. She had no assistant, no apprentice, no one to hold the stave steady while she trussed the hoops. She had to learn new ways of doing things that had always required 2 pairs of hands. She improvised jigs from scrap timber to hold pieces in place. She made mistakes, a batch of chestnut staves that split because she'd misjudged the moisture content of the wood in that building's particular draft. 3 wasted days of work and materials she could not afford. And she noted them in the margins of a fresh ledger, the way Duncan had taught her to note everything. Without blame, with as much precision as possible, so that you could understand what had happened and not repeat it. The first response to her letters came in the 2nd week of April. A fishing captain named Bertram Colley, who had ordered his herring barrels from Duncan for 11 years, wrote back in a broad, slanted hand to say that he would take 6 42-gallon barrels before the 15th of May if she could guarantee the tight coopering Duncan had always delivered. She wrote back the same day to say she could. She did not write that she had never made 6 of that specification alone, without Duncan there to check the crow's depth and the chime bevel. She knew she could do it. She had made them alongside Duncan enough times that the measurements lived in her hands. But knowing a thing and proving it are different kinds of knowing, and for 10 days after she sent that letter, she worked at the herring barrels with a concentration that was close to prayer. She finished them on the 9th of May, 6 days early. She loaded them onto August Fenwick's cart, which he lent her without being asked, and she delivered them to Captain Bertram Colley at the quay herself. He tapped each one, ran his thumb along the seam lines, and pressed the hoops with the heel of his hand. He looked at her, and she waited, he said, tight as a drum, and ordered another 6 for the fall season on the spot. Other letters began to come back. Not all of them were yes. Some did not reply at all. One merchant sent back a note that said, in terms that were polite enough to be insulting, that he preferred to work with established tradespeople. But enough said yes, enough to keep the forge running, enough to pay August Fenwick his $4, enough to build the woodpile back up and put something small aside. By July she was paying herself a wage, modest and irregular, but real. She had been at the Fenwick Cooperative for 4 months when the thing happened that changed the shape of the whole story. A woman came to her door, on an afternoon in late July, a well-dressed woman in her mid-40s, accompanied by a younger man who carried a surveyor's satchel and said very little. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Constance Aldous, and the name was known in the county because her husband had been the largest independent fish exporter on the strait before his death the previous year. Mrs. Constance Aldous explained, in the measured tones of someone accustomed to negotiations, that she had been managing her late husband's business concerns for 14 months and was in the process of evaluating all of her supplier relationships. She had heard Nora's name from Captain Colley. She had also heard it from August Fenwick, who was apparently her second cousin, a fact that Nora had not known. She said she exported on average 40,000 pounds of salt cod per season across 3 vessels, and she currently purchased all of her packing barrels from Orr & Sloane at a price she described as adequate, but a quality she described, with some precision, as variable. She asked Nora what she could offer. Nora brought out her order ledger. She showed Mrs. Constance Aldous the specifications for every barrel she had made since March. Dimensions, stave species, hoop gauge, coopered tight enough to hold a sustained column of salt brine without weeping, tested before delivery. She showed her the pricing she had worked out based on materials and time. And it was lower than Sloane's by 11 cents per barrel. Because Nora had no overhead to speak of and no margin of indolence built into her habits. She showed her, finally, one of the finished herring barrels she kept in the shop as a sample, and she let Mrs. Constance Aldous examine it however she pleased. Mrs. Aldous ran her gloved fingers along the inside of the barrel, checking the shave of the stave. She pressed the head joint. She looked at the crows, the channel where the head seated. And Nora watched her do it with the calm certainty of someone who has nothing to hide in their work. She said she would require a written guarantee of consistent quality across a minimum order of 100 barrels per season, split across spring and fall delivery. Nora said she could provide that. She said she would also require a meeting with whoever was responsible for the operation. Nora looked at her steadily and said, "You're speaking with her." There was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Mrs. Constance Aldous looked at the shop, the organized racks, the ranked tools, the stack of finished staves waiting to be trussed, the systematic notes chalked on the wall in Nora's hand. She looked back at Nora. She did not ask any of the questions that another person in her position might have asked about age, or experience, or the advisability of placing a 100-barrel contract with a young woman who had been in her own premises for 4 months. Perhaps she thought them. We cannot say. What we know is what she said, which was, "I will have my man send you the formal terms by end of week." It was the largest contract Nora had ever been offered by a distance so vast it was almost amusing. It was also, she understood immediately, the thing that would allow her to stop counting every nail. She sat with it alone that evening, in the long light of a Nova Scotia July, the shop smelling of oak and iron and pine tar, the draw knife hanging on its hook above the bench where she always put it at the end of a day. Duncan's draw knife, the rosewood handles worn smooth on the left where his thumb had rested for 40 years. She picked it up and held it in both hands. She had made a habit of this, not out of sentiment, exactly, but because it was the best balanced tool she owned, and holding it reminded her of the particular quality of attention that good work required. Duncan had told her once, in the mild and incidental way he told her most of the things that turned out to matter, that a tool remembers what it has made. She hadn't been sure then whether he meant it literally or not. She was more inclined now to think it didn't matter. He had left her nothing that the law would recognize. No property, no deed, no paper with her name on it. He had left her the knowledge of how to do a hard thing well, and the habit of writing down what went wrong so she could do it better. And a set of tools that she had learned to use until they were an extension of her own hands. He had left her 22 years of customer relationships, written in 17 order books on a shelf. He had left her his own good name spoken by the right people at the right moment, by a fishing captain who said tight as a drum, by an old farmer who remembered that a set of rain barrels had never leaked. The world would not have called any of that an inheritance. She called it everything. She did not move back into Pictou when she could afford to. She stayed at the Fenwick Cooperage and expanded it instead, adding a second drying rack and, in the spring of 1904, a small attached structure where she took on her first apprentice, a girl of 15 from a farm family near Marigamish, whose name was Ida Marsh, who had never held a draw knife before, and who learned to read the grain of oak within a year in a way that made Nora quietly and unreasonably proud. She registered her mark, NSC in a diamond, at the county hall in the fall of 1903, the first woman to hold a registered coopering mark in Pictou County. She wrote that fact in her ledger on the same page as her material costs for that month, in the same matter-of-fact hand she used for everything, because it was a fact, and facts belonged in the ledger alongside the others. Reginald Vay's solicitor wrote to her once more, 2 years after the original letter, with a proposal that the estate might be interested in selling the original cooperage building, now that it had sat vacant for several months, at a price that was lower than it had any right to be. She wrote back politely to decline. She had what she needed. She did not need what had been taken. She grew the business until it employed 3 coopers and supplied 6 of the major exporters on the strait. She never forgot the 11 days in March of 1902 when she sat with the letter and the tobacco tin and the draw knife and calculated what she had. She taught every person who came through her shop the same habit Duncan had given her. When the problem seems total, begin with the inventory. Write down what you have, not what you wish you had, and not what was taken from you. What you have, right now, in your hands. She had not been left behind. She had been handed a beginning she didn't choose, and she had built something from it that no letter from any solicitor in any barrister's society would ever be able to reach. That is Nora Sutcliffe's story, and we think it deserved to be told. We'll leave you with a question to sit with, and we'd genuinely like to know your answer in the comments. Think of a skill, a piece of knowledge, a habit of mind, something passed to you by someone who is no longer here. Do you know the true value of what they left you? Because sometimes, it takes losing everything else before you can really see it.